Hello, this is David Avlicek, and I'm going to be talking about the Heian time period that took place in Japan between 794 and 1185 AD. Heian in Japanese means peace, and during this peaceful period in Japan, there was a lot of artistic growth that was particularly defined by the aristocrats and wealthy. Part of this artistic growth was in architecture, but it also involved poetry and paintings. And this period resulted in a larger isolation between the aristocrats, the wealthy, and the commoners. Uh, this focus into art during the Heian time period and individualized culture, led by the aristocrats in particular, most likely resulted in an alienation of the lower class, but later generations, I believe, of all classes would come to benefit from the cultural advancement that took place in this Heian time period. Now, before we go into what happened during the Heian period, it's important to understand what led up to the events of the transfer into the Heian era. And what happens a lot in Japanese history is the capital would change, is particularly in medieval history when new rulers were enthroned. So the Nara period actually, and all these periods, they have a name that corresponds with the capital city that the ruler ruled in, that was the capital of Japan. They did this because they believed when their ruler died, it tainted the land, and that by moving somewhere fresh, this part particularly would be a better start for the new ruler. So the Nara period took place in Nara, Japan, and during this period they had a larger reliance on China. They were living village to village, not too much under a single emperor, but under a decentralized mode of ruling. The Shinto religion was popular, but Buddhism was made popular because of this reliance on China, these missions that they were sending to China to learn more about their culture. The upper class and the imperial court in particular, they would mimic this information and culture that they would gather on missions from China, and they would be the ones to introduce them into to mainstream culture. Some problems that were prevalent in the Nara period. There were financial burdens, which actually carried over into the era, the Heian period that we're going to be talking about. But it is what ultimately led to a change of power indirectly. So let's start with going into the change of capital, as I spoke on before. The new capital is Heian Kyo, modern day Kyoto, and that's signifies the transfer to the era that I will be talking about, the Heian period. And this city that became popular and designed on a grid pattern is not the same today. Kyoto is burned down, or it's not really well known what specifically happened to all the buildings, but it was built so long ago that the Kyoto we know today is quite different than anything that was during this time period. But anyways, there was a wide central avenue as shown through the sketch, and it separated the city into the east and western districts. The public buildings, like the Imperial Palace, some of the other buildings between closer to the central avenue, had a Chinese architectural influence, and the aristocracy, they built palaces. Now, interestingly, while Buddhism was introduced into Japanese culture. They didn't want any Buddhist temples in Heian, this capital, and the artisan quarters were another part of the district. And this this era overall, um, I'll be bringing this up again. It's cultural growth over political and economical. And what I mean by that is that we'll be going into how this era of peace led to major artistic growth. But they did struggle to rule over their people. They resorted to isolationism and more of just the ways they've ruled in the past were ritual based, and not as much of connecting directly with the people. And economical concerns continued to be prevalent as well. So to understand the Heian time period, it's important to understand that there was a hierarchical system. And the reason this is important is because what we know of today, the information we know of the Heian time period is primarily the Ryoming upper class. So the majority of what's known is from the Ryoming, the upper class, and breaking down the upper class, there is the Zako, which are just the houses that aren't in servitude to anyone, but aren't of particular higher standing. But they do they don't have any services provided to others, so they have their own servants, but it's not to such a high standing that other people have. They are independents. The craftsmen and artisans, they define their wealth by their skills, the shinabe, and that is varies much more and is something. While there is tax, it is generally a free market. So the craftsmen and artisans that were liked by especially the higher class, the imperial family and the government, they did excel. The average citizens are part of the combing group, and those in servitude of the Aristocrats, the whole lower class is the senmins, and rank even when you're getting up to the upper classes, even determined by the style of fans they would use as an accessory to their clothing. They would have fans, and with the amount of folds in a fan, that would particularly signify even class to that level. So they did really care about hierarchy in the Heian time period. And just to give, there's some larger rectangles in here, and they aren't showing specific proportions. The top imperial family, the wealthy aristocrats, were actually only 0.1% of the population. So not too many people with a majority of the wealth. Something that's interesting in the Heian time period is the prominent artistic growth from women in particular. There was certainly still a patriarchy, and men tended to be in roles of leadership, but a lot of the wealthy women were actually the creators of poetry and art. Probably the prominent artistic works during this time period were from women. One of those people being Izumi Shikibu. She was a poet, and some of her published works are well known. But what's pretty well known by her the most is her diary, and a lot of these women led more hidden lives when in pursuit of cultural ambitions, and so that's why most of our information we know about this time period today is from from collections of art that came from women. Just to speak about feminine femininity in the time. There was still a demand for beauty standards, and so women of wealth were defined by having long hair, silk robes, which we'll get into as well, and black and white makeup. They would have to even put black, not dye, but a paste, black paste on their teeth. They did this because their teeth, when you put white all over your face, it would amplify the yellowness of their teeth. And instead of doing white, they did black, and that was just the style of makeup during that day. So when you initially think like wearing silk, you think light, maybe, but in fact, they could wear up to 40 layers of silk, and it was actually very heavy. Of course, once you're getting to 40 layers. And there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. It's not general, it's in terms of culture and personification. The Chinese culture was considered to be masculine. Art and cultural growth was primarily driven by men. But interestingly, in the Heian time period, the Japanese started to develop a different direction in culture, a more feminine culture. And this is because the Heian time period, we did talk about how they had a good relationship with China before, and resulting in Buddhism being influenced into Japanese culture. But during the Heian time period, everyone just became a little bit more isolationist, and that included the whole country being just isolated from China. They stopped their missions, and they looked more internally in terms of cultural growth than reaching out to China. One of the most prominent building works that is still around today is the Phoenix Hall. It's part of the Byodo-in Palace, and it was built in 1053, and it's an expansion of the Byodo-in Palace, and it's meant for Buddhism. There is a shrine in the center, which I'll show in the next plan picture. The structure was wood. Of course, it has not survived. The same wood has not survived over 1,000 years. This building has been continuously renovated, improved on, and materials being replaced. And there has even been times where they needed to outright fix or completely change the design. So what we see today may be a glorification, or maybe a little bit different than how it was actually constructed in 1053, which is a really long time ago. Marble staircase, main entry, painted red and white, starting to see Chinese culture being an influence, but they are going their own direction in layout. There's two reasons why it could be called the Phoenix Hall. There's two golden phoenix statues on the roof. That is the primary drive to the name, but also the shape of the building looks like a phoenix landing, and it faces a man-made pond, which is actually abnormal for this specific architectural style. Typically, they wanted to incorporate into natural elements, and usually they didn't alter the environment or landscaping, but they did in this case. Here's a plan view later on the Phoenix Hall, and it actually goes into detail on the let's see. Oh, you should know that this is not a plan. Of course, it's not an original plan from 1053, and it is not how it was in 1053. This is a more recent plan within the last 100 years. So this is there may have been changed elements, but the general footprint of the building is similar to how it was first constructed. The Phoenix Hall has two L-shaped wings that form an overall U shape. It is symmetrical, and it uses slender columns. But what you can tell from the symmetry is it really amplifies the central point of the Phoenix Hall, which is where there is a Buddha statue, and they had varying roof heights, which can be seen in the center. And let me point them out. Even parts of the same space in the Phoenix Hall, this central space, is even carrying different roof heights all everywhere. And this is just to amplify further the symmetry that is within the Phoenix Hall. And the architectural style that is somewhat prevalent in the Phoenix Hall that was created during the Heian time period is the Shinden Zukuri. And this architectural style was very prominent among aristocrats' estates. It was very, very popular for the artistic growth in Heian, the Heian time period, and all the wealthy families that were becoming more cultured and engaging in all these art forms, painting, poetry, they tended to live on estates that look just like this. You can see that it still has that symmetry in forming a U shape, and the landscaping in particular, in most cases, unlike the Phoenix Hall before, it is natural, and they would alter the design to better suit the landscaping, and they would choose the site based on the landscape. The wealthy wanted to be in areas that had natural wealth as well, to focus on their art, their lifestyle, and to amplify their beauty. And you can see this gate, this earth wall and gates that surround this entire structure. And I believe this is can lead up to 3.5 acres in building footprint, because it's a very it's not compact. It builds out, and this whole area would kind of create a little bit of a campus, a courtyard for just the wealthy and aristocrats to be in. And this, while it's beautiful and certainly a place that I would even enjoy being in, and never want to leave, it caused an isolationism problem that was brought up earlier. The aristocrats isolated themselves from the commoners, from the average person, in their pursuit of art and beauty and culture, but started to lose that connection that rulers and leaders need to with the common people. Now this style had declined in popularity after the Heian time period, and this is because of the rise of samurais and military. There's actually a very similar architectural style to this that is just tailored to military application. And that's what started to become more popular in the next time period, and more and more on this style. You can see traces of it in more modern Japanese architecture. Of course, it starts style starts from somewhere, but buildings that actually look like this, there's actually no true surviving structures today that incorporate all the architectural styles, the beliefs that the Heian estates had. Now the center part, we'll go over the different elements of the Shinden Zukuri, but the Shinden Hall was the primary heart of the estate, and everything branched out from there. And this is where the Lord, or if it was the emperor, the emperor's main place as well. But we have the Shinden. This is a nice architectural plan that was provided by a pretty by Anthony Bryant in 2000 for Japanese literature at Indiana University, and I have all the citations for it at the end, but I just wanted to amplify the importance of this individual. He he's studied specifically the Shindenzukuri and all of its elements, even though there is only models, like scaled models of the estates today. And he goes into depth about even sizing of the specific elements of this architectural style. And so the Shinden, like I was talking about before, is the heart of the estate. And from there, it branches out into these opposed houses. They are the secondary to the heart of the estate. Think like rooms for maybe not the highest leader or the most wealthy or the ruler of the household. We're thinking people who are related but not in a role of power. Now there are Wadaridono verandas. They go around these corners and they match the hallways and corridors that go through. We have the Sukiwata Dono. Sorry, my pronunciation for these is a little bit harder because of the it's not typical pronunciation. These are very specific architectural elements in Japanese buildings. So the Sukiwata Dono are right here, and they are what bridge and connects the heart, the Shinden, to these opposed houses, the Tainoya. And then the row, the wings, they are these long, almost bridge-like applications that, as we saw before, go out into the landscaping. All of this, I forgot to mention before, it's on an elevated plank floor, which caused problems because this is a relatively colder time period. And while it's beautiful to be elevated and off the ground, there was a problem with quality of life, even for the wealthy, because their buildings weren't well insulated against a colder climate. Anyways, these wings led to these open pavilions at the end, which were often next to the natural ponds. And they were called Tsuridono. So like I mentioned earlier, the space takes up like a 3.5 acre area, which is pretty significant for the fact that it's just a simple estate. What we do today is much more compact as we go, into second levels. But this is all a main floor application, and there's no second, at least not typically, no second stories, no basements. Of course, these are raised even off the ground, so it is using up a lot of land and a lot of space around for landscaping and for walking. And there's a lot of separation between an estate that's still connected, which does have a unique beauty to it. Now going down to what these aristocrats did in their everyday life. We talked about the up to 40 layers of silk that they would wear, and their outfit was called the junito, and it means 12 layers. And it did not mean it's called 12 layers, but it is not exclusively 12 layers of silk. They would actually layer even more on. The full name of this outfit is the Itsutsukinu Karagino Mu, and it's worn by females primarily in the imperial court and the people living in these fancy estates that we've just been going through. They had a specific color symbolization for the different feelings of the seasons, not tied directly to the colors, like having orange in autumn. They tried to portray through color the feelings that were invoked by the individual seasons, not trying to necessarily match the colors of any leaves or sky during that time of year. Like mentioned earlier, they one of the main accessories is the fan that they even the amount of folds indicate prosperity. And only one layer in this entire outfit has evolved into what we know today as the modern kimono. So I just want to make it clear how heavy this outfit was, and they certainly were not agile while wearing it, and it was restricting, and possibly a sign of a patriarchal influence in how men would seek to wanting to see women, but that is up to debate. So one thing throughout this whole discussion about what the Heian time period was like, a problem that occurs is that there's this inherent bias in what we see with this art, for example. This beautiful art is created by only the wealthy, and how the wealthy perceive their own lives. And the problem with this is that they were isolated. They didn't connect with their own people too often, and this caused for maybe a little bit of bias in how we perceive the Heian time period. For example, the samurai were actually steadily increasing in power in popularity throughout this era, and is what leads to the feudalism of the next era. And this isolationism, this development of arts, almost comes at a cost. Everyone had lower life expectancies, even the aristocrats. 27 to 33, they were not very sanitary. They didn't bathe too often, and they actually were. Some of them were more overweight. They didn't weren't too much into fitness. A lot of the poor relied on religion, like seen in other medieval countries in the time. For example, the European Crusades. They relied on Buddhism and other religions like Shinto for having a purpose, a relief from their struggles from work and everyday life. Now, we talked about the upper class and lower class, but the lowest of the lower class, considered non-persons, probably struggled the most as of any time period, and that would be the slaves and the outcasts. Skilled tradesmen and the rice farmers of this time period, they could earn a fortune if they worked hard and develop a name for themselves, and advance social standing. But it was harder, certainly much harder for them, considering a lot of the Heian estates, these wealthy people, they didn't even rule that much. They just explored artistic growth and culture. Okay. For perspective, I wanted to kind of tie in everything that I've been talking about, because right now it's a lot of facts. So culture-reversed aristocrats pushed the artistic boundaries within isolation, and I talked about that. That's a problem, because we see a biased art today, but we also can admire the cultural growth that these aristocrats have pushed through this relatively long time period. Quality of life, we can make assumptions, but it's really hard to determine based on this artistic bias and lack of understanding of the commoners during this time period, how hard it was during the Heian time period for a commoner. Like in many places around the world, it has taken time for the commoners of Japan to advocate for improvement of quality of life. And I brought up the Edo period because that is when education was introduced to the commoners, and that led to a more rapid growth of cultural understanding, literacy, and making sure that it was a more inclusive culture after that. So at the end of the Heian period, there was a political shift important to note is that these wealthy aristocrats and their estates weren't necessarily burned to the ground and they weren't necessarily killed. They were so isolated, they kind of let them be. And the primary problem for why there was a change in power was that the emperor of the time, he was granting a lot of large estates tax-free to other top nobles around Japan. And this divided his power up significantly to the point where now it was multiple people with a lot of different power. And you can see how this leads to a feudalism, to shoguns, to samurai in the next era, which is the Kamakura era. And it's where warlords are reigning over the specific feudal kingdoms. They adopt a military code, the new ruler, and he relocates the capital once again. And it's land-based economy of feudalism. So there's this shift from cultural richness to feudalism, and it's caused from the fact that they were so isolated that they were politically weak, and the economy didn't successfully grow after the end of the previous era. All these things are just bound to happen over time, in some sense, the exchange of rulers and leaders. And I think the important note to make overall is that the focus that these aristocrats had on arts and culture probably resulted in the alienation of the lower class and of the eventual inevitable move to the feudalism and samurai and shoguns of the next era. But I would like to think that that this cultural exploration, this artistic growth, has benefited Japan overall for later generations, moving forward into a more military style feudalism. And that's my overall thoughts on the Heian time period, and how the artistic growth of the wealthy probably resulted in the end of its era, and also influenced the culture of Japan that we know of today. So it's equally as important.